During the many rehearsals that followed, and over a good deal of time, Platon began to explain the principles, actually just one all-embracing principle, that governs this kind of singing, and consequently of playing, of making music. As simple and, believe me, as complex as the cry of a newborn babe. Teaching was part of Platon's mission. Aside from working with unerring dedication on his own singing and painting, his other goal in life was to convert people. If it's true that everybody whose voice box is in working order can sing, then it's equally true that to become a singer one has to at least have the desire to sing. Because he found this simple truth hard to accept, the number of times his well-meaning efforts backfired are legion. We would sometimes rehearse at my flat and enjoy listening to cassette recordings I'd brought with me from New Zealand. Because I'd been unable to part with some of my golden oldies, I'd transferred some of their recordings onto audio cassettes. CDs hadn't been invented yet. In the middle of Amelita Galli-Curci's inimitable rendition of Massenet's Sevillana, Platon mumbles to himself, "Ston." "Ston?" I asked. "Stonata? That means off-key in Italian." "No, ston is Russian for lament." He left it at that. Another day it was Caruso singing Musica Proibita by Gastaldon that elicited the same reaction. Molto ston, he said, but again left it at that. The recordings that came next on the cassette tape were Shaliapin's mischievous rendition of the folk song Down the Petersky. After that came Rosa Poncel singing O Nume Tutelar from Spontini's La Vestale. With Shaliapin and Poncel, well, here Platon exclaimed with a laugh, veramente molto ston. It got me thinking. I'd always felt instinctively that there was a divide between singers of old and the ones performing in the 1970s. All great artists, mind you, all very charismatic, some of whom I'd seen and heard live. But I thought, rather superficially, that this separation that I perceived, this something that was missing in the modern-day singers and instrumentalists, was simply a matter of changing fashions. Very soon it was my turn to come under Platon's zealous fire. We were taking a break during rehearsals one day, when I asked him if he knew the movie My Fair Lady. I illustrated by singing the first phrase of the song, I Could Have Danced All Night. I never found out whether he knew the movie or not, because his first reaction was, you have a voice, you should sing. Again, my reaction was, what? I was completely taken aback. I had never even considered singing. My speaking voice was barely audible, and anyway, my energies had always been channeled into piano playing. That fateful allusion to My Fair Lady was to lead to years of training under Platon's relentless quest for yet another goal, to make a singer out of me. My reluctance was hard to overcome, but eventually I succumbed. With Platon, you had no choice. And years later, I was able to gain a good deal of pleasure and professional satisfaction from my efforts. So, aiming at this way of playing, with an added dimension, especially accompanying this way, now went hand in hand with singing. Platon prefaced our first lesson by saying that singing is based on the lament and the smile together. How intriguing was that? Tears and laughter together. He then continued by explaining what a real lament is. It's the cry of the newborn baby, for instance, or a grown person's heartfelt weeping. Can you cry like a baby, or can you groan like you're in pain? What a thought! How embarrassing! I hardly knew this person, and I was supposed to make these noises while he scrutinized the results. Try, look, imitate me, he said, and started groaning as though he were in the depths of misery and despair. Oh, 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 oh. I tried, but what I produced sounded more like water gurgling down a blocked drain pipe, and anyway, it made my throat hurt. Can you laugh? Out of nowhere, he produced a belly laugh. That had me giggling. It's the same thing, he assured me. Clasp your hands, one on top of the other, on your chest, and think of something like deep sorrow, or else pretend you're an actor, pretending to express deep sorrow. No good either. The result sounded fake. Look, like this, he continued. Platon repeated this lament countless times. Oh, oh, oh. When eventually I overcame my embarrassment, instead of groaning, instead of producing a sound expressing pain, I actually sang a note. Ah, heaven forbid. No, I don't want you to sing. All I want is a groan, un lamento. We were, after all, speaking in Italian. Ston, he repeated in Russian. Although Platon would have insisted on getting this first step right before proceeding, I begged him to let go of this point for now and to come back to it later. He grudgingly agreed. Maestro Vitale was even more dogmatic in his approach. He refused to let his students go a single step further if that first free fall, caduta libera, of the forearm wasn't entirely free. The difficulty of reproducing a natural lament reminded me of the same effort that went into doing something as seemingly simple as letting the forearm drop onto the keyboard without actually guiding it there. Okay, let's do a series of short, very intense laments, he said. Again, I felt silly, and I also wondered what the neighbours must be thinking. I tried my best, but it was obvious my sounds bore little resemblance to what Platon's normally beautiful voice now sounded like. And that was pretty awful. A toneless, guttural moan that had little bearing with what he produced when singing. But we persisted. Okay, let's do 3 short laments followed by 1 long one. Look. I tried to imitate him, and after a few clumsy efforts, actually started to groan. While I tried over and over again, consolidating this first step, Platon would remind me to let go, abbandonare, to try to rid myself of any tension around the throat, neck, and torso. I was told to plant my feet on the ground, roughly the same distance apart as my shoulders, keeping my legs firm and straight. He compared the legs to a sturdy tree trunk supporting its branches, which are like our torso and arms, swaying gently in the breeze, with the spinal column remaining erect but flexible. This again reminded me of Vitale's method, which called for abandoning the arms and focusing one's attention on the fingertips of steel, d'acciaio, as the maestro described them. The fingertips act as unerring support for the fingers, hands, and arms, while the shoulders remain erect but never raised or tense. As a certain fluency began to take place while I repeated the sequence of 3 short laments plus 1 long one, what began to emerge was the principle of dynamicity. I felt I was reaching towards an arrival point. I knew where I was going. The 3 short laments were the run-up or springboard leading to the leap, which was the long lament or the concluding part of the phrase. Ah, 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 ah. To help with the realization of the long lament, Platon quoted his teacher Michael Schwartz, who used the French word impédance in the sense of resistance or obstacle to illustrate the correct sensation when lamenting and then singing. That is, while expanding the chest, one should feel as though it's pressing against an invisible barrier or impediment. This helps accumulate both energy and compactness in the voice, while giving the singer more stamina. It is what is also called the appoggio, or support. Some ballet dancers use the same principle of impédance in the movements of their limbs by imagining moving them underwater, as though against an outside force. And who was Michael Schwartz? Back in the USSR, Platon had had the great good fortune to study singing with this interesting personality, a singing teacher active in Russia between the 1950s and 1970s, who was also a trained engineer. Platon acknowledged his indebtedness to him for restoring his voice after courses with teachers who had led him down the wrong path. In the years preceding the revolution of 1917, Schwartz attended many performances of the great Italian singers who were frequent guest artists at the Mariinsky Theatre. During this time, he heard Mattia Battistini and Tita Ruffo among the baritones, as well as Luisa Tetrazzini and other great names from the heyday of bel canto. With his engineer's eye, he analyzed the physical movements that produced such fine singing, which combined a natural timbre with diction, musical line, and resonant projection in the theatre with apparent ease. His conclusions, passed on to at least 2 generations, helped salvage many voices ruined through misuse. Now that I was getting the hang of it, I was told to practice the lament at home. If my roommates or neighbours commented with a curious, "What on earth's going on?" the lament I was producing was fake. If, on the other hand, said Platon, people overhearing my efforts came rushing into the room, concerned for my well-being, "What on earth's going on?" I was on the right track. Platon warned against the false lament, as he called it, a kind of hoot, ooh, used by some singers to hit high notes, for instance, or to express pathos, so close to the real thing, and yet only a traitorous substitute for true artistry. At the time, I was sharing an apartment with a genteel Japanese couple, both musicians. They were alarmed by my fake laments, and later on, by my real ones too. But then I had to deal with the next hurdle. I found myself getting out of breath, especially before the last lament, that long one. I was too intent on getting all the other bits and pieces right to think about breathing. When do I breathe? And anyway, what has all this to do with bel canto? I asked. Don't think about breathing, came the exasperating reply. And then, continuing on from describing the free lament as the basis of the singing voice, and many experts have defined opera singing and authentic folk singing as a controlled scream, he pointed out that when we groan in pain, or when a newborn baby lets out a wail, or when we laugh uproariously, or else let out a scream of terror, or a cry of acute pleasure or surprise, or weep until it feels like our hearts will break, do we think about taking in air beforehand? No. On the contrary, each of these expressions of the human soul comes about spontaneously. The conscious intake of air does not occur the way most people think it does. I thought about that for a moment. True. I had already noticed that when Platon sang, he didn't huff and puff, and I suddenly realized I never noticed him taking a breath in before a phrase. That was especially apparent when he sang long phrases where his voice seemed to pour out effortlessly, as in the last part of Valleco's cavatina from Rachmaninoff's opera of the same name. You see, as soon as a baby is born, it cries out. Its wail is an expression of shock as it makes its entry into this cold new world after 9 months spent in the warmth and protection of its mother's belly. That's how Platon started to explain this phenomenon. Before uttering this first spontaneous lament, the newborn doesn't stop to think about whether it needs an intake of air. It simply lets fly. It's only after the baby has produced its introductory visiting card, the announcement of its arrival among us, that it proceeds to breathe regularly. The voice is a primordial function of the human being, with breathing being a separate function altogether, and neither should interfere with the other when speaking or declaiming or singing. This resonant cry, ah, 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 plays an essential role. That of communicating to its mother what the baby is feeling: hunger, thirst, or a tummy ache, discomfort or pain of any kind, cold or heat, or simply needing to see its mother's face. Anybody who's been present while a tiny human creature is squalling will appreciate the intensity of its ear-splitting result. If for some reason nobody picks it up, the baby may exhaust itself after bawling endlessly, but its voice will never sound hoarse. I thought about this, and I had to agree. He continued, "And here we come to the first important principle of voice production, that is, how a baby attains the seemingly limitless vocal stamina. The answer lies in the spontaneous production of that cry, lament, or wail, with no physical preparation whatsoever. In that split second after the collapse of its rib cage, which occurs just before the start of a new lament, the amount of air necessary enters the lungs of its own accord. That's how the abdomen and laryngeal apparatus of the tiny body remain free and unfettered to function while it cries. The sequence of movements, then, is the following. Each lament, whether short or long, is emitted as soon as the rib cage reaches its ideal state of collapse. Platon used the Russian term zbros to describe this. A baby's single lament or phrase then proceeds with growing intensity of volume, culminating in a release, an audible venting of tension. Wah! This is produced both vocally and bodily, through the intense but extremely short final movement of each expanding movement of the spinal column, rib cage, and chest, before the upper body collapses once more, to then proceed to the next lament. Ah, 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 ah. So, each new phrase begins with the body in a state of relative repose and returns to it. Very important. Having established that the lament is produced while the rib cage is in a state of expansion, it's important to note that the quality of this movement depends on the length of the baby's lament. A series of short wails will be produced by a corresponding series of short but intense movements, going from the state of collapsed to the fully expanded chest and torso and back again. Ah, 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 ah. The shorter the lament, the more intense the trajectory. A long wail, on the other hand, calls for a greater husbanding of resources, which by some miracle of nature the newborn baby does instinctively. Ah! 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 Consequently, the moment of expansion and release comes only at the very end of the baby's protracted lament. It took a while to assimilate all this, but I was eager to try again. While the collapse and lament series started to become more natural, one so-called phrase leading to an inexorable succession of phrases, still only lamented, not sung, mind you, Platon would correct more vital details. After checking that we're standing correctly, it's important to look at a point in the near distance just slightly lower than your own eye level. This way, the nape of the neck is never compressed, nor does the head flop lifelessly about when the spinal column and abdomen do their free fall. This ensures a beautifully straight spinal column that is neither arched nor bent forward. The shoulders should be kept relaxed, and one should think of oneself with pride, with a feeling of well-being while maintaining a balanced stance. What brought this aspect home to me was Platon's description of his own teacher's method of getting his students to prepare psychologically and physically for singing. Michael Schwartz lived in one of Leningrad's drab neighborhoods full of high-rise apartment buildings. "Look outside the window," he'd say. "Look, the Bay of Naples." The very thought of this sun-drenched view of the Mediterranean and Vesuvius in the distance was supposed to make one stand tall, shoulders back, chest puffed out in happiness. It certainly got a smile or two, even if the smile was tinged with irony. And with this hint of a smile, with our lips parted slightly, just like we see in archaic Greek sculptures, we're ready to laugh, cry, speak, or sing. "Now we can start," said Platon, "to collapse and lament and then return to the same starting point." He clapped his hands with loosely held wrists and arms, each clap functioning like a trampoline, sending the next clap into motion. He did this again and again. Like this, he explained. It was like watching a springboard go boing, 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 boing. The movements involving the upper part of the body should always be elastic, never rigid. Here, with the principle expressed in physical terms, one actually felt the analogy with the natural inexorability of phrasing that the lament sets in motion. As for returning to the same starting point, for anybody familiar with the Feldenkrais method, it's what practitioners call the neutral point or 0 point, the position our body needs to be in before it can act. Let me give you an example. If you're sitting curled up in a chair, you have to uncurl yourself, put both feet on the floor, and sit squarely on the chair, feet planted on the ground, before being able to stand up in a single movement. That point, the one that allows you to stand up, is the so-called neutral point or 0 point. That's what the upright stance described just now allows you to do in singing. Like everybody else who essayed this method, after the first few lessons I managed to grasp the theory, but then the practice, making the sequence of movements come automatically, was another thing altogether. One mistake I made, and this is made by many people, was to blow out air as I did the free fall of my rib cage. That quickly leads to apnea, a lack of breath, asphyxiation. A lot of time was spent trying to dissociate the two types of movement, the collapse of the rib cage from the breathing out. Let me draw another parallel, this time with athletics. There's a basic difference between the amount of energy required for singing and the amount required for certain sports where people do indeed puff out before lifting weights or while swimming or running. Again, I remembered my frustration as a child when our swimming instructor told us to take in a deep breath before putting our faces into the water as we tried the freestyle or front crawl. I found myself accumulating too much air and then gasping until I eventually cheated by simply following what my body asked me to do, and that was not to take in air, but to let out a puff of air each time I turned my head on its side. At the time, I didn't realize that I was actually taking in a tiny amount, only as much as was needed, before putting my face in the water again. It all happened in a split second. When, after some trial and error, one finally gets the sequence of movements, with the breathing now automatic, the feeling of elation is immense. Funnily enough, what had set me on this path of discovery of the voice was an excerpt from a song expressing Eliza's exhilaration at finally having got it. Professor Higgins has been trying to correct her pronunciation, and she finally manages to say "the rain in Spain," etc., to his satisfaction. Now, I too felt like saying, "By George, I've got it." It's like a positive domino effect. One thing calls for the next, and everything slips into place automatically. And then you ask yourself, what was so difficult about that? At this point, everybody's question is, now what? We start analyzing the quality of the sound we're producing and to want to know how this will help us to sing. We stick to the inspirational example of the newborn baby. What of the actual tone produced by it? It is, in effect, an indefinite vowel sound that varies from one individual to the next. Platon pointed out that the steady, unaltered purity of this cry is achieved spontaneously thanks to an absolute minimum of movement. Thanks, that is, to the stability of the baby's jaw, especially during each phrase or wail emitted. The sound of this vague vowel and the intensity of the voice are never warped. It's up to the individual to find the most comfortable position by simply dropping the jaw and keeping that space more or less stable. Platon referred to the steadiness of the canal, again in Russian, or vocal tube, as being of the utmost importance in the purity and efficiency of voice production, the proof lying in the way we all sing so efficiently as newborn babies. When working with new pupils, Platon used to say with enthusiasm, "We're all born great singers." This was not only his way of encouraging those less than confident in their innate vocal gifts to develop their singing potential to the best of their capabilities. Platon firmly believed in the infinite human capacity for development and fulfillment of all talents, great or small, bestowed upon us. The enthusiasm with which he tried to persuade people of all ages to study singing was sometimes met with astonishment, not to mention loud protestations on the part of those targeted by Platon's missionary zeal. But that's another story. To return to the subject of tiny infants, the state of this inherently ideal method of voice production remains constant for as long as the baby is breastfeeding. However, as it progresses to eating solid foods that require chewing, this very chewing motion begins to interfere with the purity of its voice production simply because the tube tends to become warped. However, along with this disadvantage comes a much greater advantage. Very soon after we're done with simply wailing and lamenting, we begin to appreciate the positive aspects of this world we were born into, and consequently we add laughter and merriment to our lamentations. A tiny baby will begin to gurgle and smile and then eventually laugh as loudly as it can wail, given the right stimuli. It will retain the same unfettered, unfiltered qualities of spontaneity of expression throughout its infancy. I'm sure you've noticed the similarities between heartfelt sobbing and uproarious laughter in both children and adults. Physically, it's the same succession of movements that produces both seemingly opposite emotions. The more important point I'm making here, however, is that when we happen to hear either sobbing or hilarity from a distance, it's not always easy to distinguish one from the other. In other words, this collapse cry or collapse laugh cycle produces almost identical vocal effects. On a more philosophical level, one can see laughter and tears as being the opposite sides of the same coin of the human condition.